Goeiemôre. Soos gewoonlik begin ek om verskoning te vra dat ek in Engels gaan praat. Soos u kan hoor, is my alledaagse Afrikaans nogal nie te sleg nie, maar as ek by die tegniese taal kom, dan hakkel en struikel ek 'n bietjie. So ek gaan maar in Engels praat, maar stel asseblief u vra of maak u voorstelle in Afrikaans. I want to talk about teaching as a profession today. And just reflect on that and what it might mean. And what it means, I think, for the future of education in South Africa. Professor de Villiers quite correctly points out the very great importance of higher education to a country's development, to an individual family's wealth. But of course, to get there requires good primary and good secondary schooling. He mentioned the huge dropout rate. Something like half of all university graduates drop out without graduating with anything. And as he quite correctly said, that is a massive wastage. If we could just select those who are going to pass and only take those, we could achieve the same thing. And in fact, then we'd have more space to produce higher quality. But we have this massive dropout problem. And in fact, even a low participation rate. He mentioned we're at 17%. We're trying to get to 25% by 2030. South Korea is at something like 95%. You can see why countries like that are flying. So what's the problem in South Africa? I think it's pretty well known by now that it's the quality of our school system that is such a huge problem. And I want to come at this problem from the perspective of what it means to be a profession. Many would say that teaching, and I'm with them, is not a profession because although many of our teachers, and I'm sure this applies to those who are supported by Rapport, Onderwysfonds, certainly act very ethically, they're always on time, they never overstep the boundaries with their learners. They are pillars of a good behavior in the community. That's good, but that's not a professional. That's just a starting point for any good employee. What professions have is that they share a common body of knowledge and skills that they use to advance the best interests of their clients. Firstly, they've got a body of knowledge on which their practice is based. Think of medicine. Think of the theories of engineering, from which we derive these very practical skills of building bridges. Education doesn't have that. Teaching doesn't have that. And I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail where the problems are. Furthermore, not only do they have this body of knowledge, but they establish a set of standards that they jealously guard. Interestingly, the Engineering Council of South Africa 2 years ago said to UCT, one of the 250 best universities in the world apparently, that their second year electrical engineering course was not up to scratch and that they were perfectly at liberty to pass those students and give them degrees, but they would not be recognized by the Engineering Council of South Africa. That's a profession. They guard those boundaries of their standards jealously. Teaching's not there. And here's Professor Crane Sudin, recently appointed head of the HSRC, talking in his capacity as chair of the Higher Education Quality Council review of initial teacher education. He said this in 2008, and in 2010, the HEQC published their review of initial teacher education programs at our universities. This is what Crane said about literacy in our universities. We do not have a body of empirical work and theoretical engagement that is able to speak to this situation. He's referring to the disastrous SACMEC tests, where South Africa does so badly. After almost 50 years of serious research into teaching and learning, we cannot say without qualification what works and what does not. We don't know how to teach reading, guys. Our teachers don't know how to teach reading, and we don't know what to do about it as university educators. You know, we dump on the Minister of Education, we dump on SATU, we bash the teachers. Colleagues, this is the problem. We don't have a knowledge base. We don't know how to teach our teachers how to teach reading. And, so the HEQC reported on, they did a survey of all the universities, PGCE, B.Ed, Masters, and the ACE programs, and they came up with some rather devastating conclusions about the quality of our initial teacher education programs. They reviewed 81 programs in all. Fewer than half of them received full accreditation. And 22% were either not accredited at all or on notice of withdrawal, and the remainder were conditionally accredited. Now, I'm going to come back to this point because actually this is not a uniquely South African problem. It's a worldwide, well, it's not a worldwide problem. It's a problem in the English-speaking world particularly. And I'm going to point out what some of the other countries are trying to do about this and how we, in fact, are on a better footing than some of those other countries. But I'll get there. Now, here's the result of our not being able to teach reading in schools. And I don't expect you to read this whole slide, but I just want to point out a couple of things. This is the progress in reading literacy study. It's an international study. Something like 40 countries participate. In 2006, South African grade 4 and 5 learners participated across the country, and we came up with some rather shocking results. If you look right at the bottom, the low international benchmark, if you exhibit mastery over the low international benchmark, then you are able to reproduce information that is explicitly stated in the text. Jabu had a dog named Spot. What was the dog's name? Spot. That's an explicit question. Or making straightforward inferences. 3/4 of South African intermediate phase learners can't do that. They've been at school for 5 years, hulle kan glad nie lees nie. We talk about critical and creative thinking, guys. The advanced international benchmark is about critical thinking. So I completely agree with Professor de Villiers. It's not something you teach explicitly on the side. It's something that's embedded first and foremost in the language of learning and teaching. That's where creative thinking, that's where your ability to do critical and creative thinking lies. So if you're at the advanced international benchmark, you're able to integrate information across challenging texts. You can pick up things across texts. You can have an opinion on those texts. You can support it with evidence from the text. That's critical thinking, guys. It's not a magic wand out there. It's right there in the language. Now, we want to do away with these old books with Shakespeare and Milton and William Faulkner because we want to read modern stuff. Guys, there's a reason why Shakespeare has lasted for 600 years as the preeminent writer in the world. It's because of his subtlety of thought and the subtlety of characterization, the creativity and critical thinking that goes into those incredible plays. We study those books, a bit of that will rub off on us. So we know what our learners can't do. This is what our teachers can't do. The SACMEC 3 iteration of this set of tests that are written by Southern and Eastern African countries, including South Africa, in 2010, they tested teachers in South Africa. Grade 6 teachers in English and maths. This is the English scores. So remember the low international benchmark, retrieving information explicitly stated in the text. Our teachers don't do too badly on that. They get an average of about 75%. But as we start moving into the higher order cognitive skills, inferential reasoning, interpretive reasoning, evaluative reasoning, we start dropping rather dramatically. So colleagues, the critical thinking is not in our teachers. So there's no way they can get it into the learners. 80% of our learners coming out of the school system do English first additional language. That is a subject they have to pass, and that is the subject in which they do all their other subjects. The ministerial task team that reported last year on the NSC had a very interesting chapter on English first additional language. In fact, I think just for that chapter, it's one of the most important documents that are coming out of the education system for some time. What they did was they analyzed the cognitive level, the levels of cognitive demand of the EFAL matric papers. And this is what they said. The cognitive level are heavily weighted towards lower order skills, low international benchmark, explicitly retrieving information, not given sufficient opportunity to explain and analyze content, purpose, and audience of texts, no critical thinking in EFAL. The majority of questions require short answers. If you're not giving extended answers, you can't develop an argument. You can't have a point of view. You've just got a blunt yes, no. And even the grammatical activities were routine, drill and practice stuff. So colleagues, our primary school learners can't read. Our high school learners come out of school with very low levels of academic literacy. Our teachers don't know the subjects they're teaching. What are we going to do about it? Where do we break this cycle? It just keeps going round and round. Where is the best point to break this cycle of mediocrity? Well, I want to propose that it should happen in the universities. It should happen with our teacher training. Okay? And indeed, whether you see that as the key point for breaking this vicious cycle or not, you would at least expect our teacher educators to look at the 3 slides I've just shown you and said, gee whiz, what are we going to do about this? You would expect them to try and take their learners up to high levels of English, critical thinking, and maths and all the other subjects they're supposed to be doing. You would expect them to teach their teachers how to teach reading, because we can see that a primary school teacher, it doesn't matter which grade they're teaching at, it doesn't matter what subject they're teaching. You can be teaching history in grade 5. If your kids can't read the history book, well, you better do something about it. You better identify what the problem is and be able to take them through that reading difficulty they're having. So you would expect all primary school teachers to get a lot of reading pedagogy in their undergraduate courses. Okay, how are these expectations being met? The initial teacher education research project, which I've been busy with for the last 5 years, has been looking at these questions. We took 5 campuses across the country, representing the main institutional types. So it's not just historically advantaged or historically disadvantaged, contact, distance, urban, rural, all the types. We're trying to get a look at the system as a whole. Of course, that's not a representative sample, but these 5 universities that we looked at collectively produce half of our teachers. So it's quite a big chunk of the system. And we looked at the intermediate phase curricula for maths and English in the B.Ed. And we found some rather startling things. For example, remember those guys are coming out of school with very, very low levels of English. They're going to have to go into schools and teach in English. Of course, most of the teachers here are exceptional to that, teaching in Afrikaans, but the same applies to Afrikaans. If you don't have very high levels of cognitive skills in the language of learning and teaching, you're not going to be able to teach anything properly. But we picked English because, of course, it's 80-90% of the country's schools use English as the language of learning and teaching. So what do the universities, these 5 campuses, do to these kids who are coming out of school with very low levels of academic literacy in English? You would expect them to pump these guys full of English. Well, on 3 of the campuses, A, B, and D, they get no, if they're not specializing in English as a subject, they get no subject English. And in fact, they get some academic literacy because that's a widely recognized problem. These kids can hardly read and write, so they get quite a bit of academic literacy. But even there, there's a huge variation. On Campus E, they get 2 full years of academic literacy. On Campus D, they get 2 semesters. So again, there's a huge variation here. There's a lack of consensus on how this problem should be dealt with. But overall, I think, in fact, the next slide shows it rather better. Ek dink die battery is pap. Oh, there it is. So foundation, intermediate phase teachers, they're specializing to go into grades 4, 5, and 6 in our schools. Some of them take English as a specialization. They get quite a lot of English in their courses, up to 25% or 15% of the total B.Ed is taken up with English courses. But look at the guys who are not specializing as English teachers, the bottom row. 6%, 7.5%, 5%. Is that enough to get them from where they were, those very low levels of EFL that they got out of matric? Now they've got to go into schools and explain science and history using English. Is this enough? I doubt it. But, colleagues, an even more disturbing thing, and this is a complete puzzle to me. Kan julle die ding daar agter aanskuif, asseblief? Okay, I've said that. They should all be getting English as a very strong foundation in the language of learning and teaching. But yeah, about reading pedagogy, here's a comment that our report writer made. This is Yvonne Reed, who did the study for us. It appears that across all 5 institutions, there may be insufficient focus on equipping student teachers to guide intermediate phase learners to become proficient readers and writers of text in a range of genres and modes. We're not teaching them to teach reading. Volgende een asseblief. Teaching reading is complex and challenging. What is evident from the data is that each of the universities in the study approaches this topic differently. Now remember, colleagues, a profession has a standard of practice. A profession has a strong theory of how to teach reading. Arising out of that, strong pedagogical practices. They've got standards and they guard them carefully. These 5 campuses, they all do it differently. It's a Tower of Babel out there. They have no common understanding of how to teach reading. So each of the 5 campuses approaches this topic differently, but may not be doing enough. Now, Yvonne Reed is well known for her understatement. May not be doing enough, I think, is the understatement of the century, to equip beginner teachers with the knowledge and skills to support struggling readers on the one hand, and remember, 75% of our grade 5s are struggling readers, on the one hand, or to extend excellent readers on the other. We talk about excellence. Where's this excellence going to come from if we don't start laying the foundations in our schools? Volgende een asseblief. Yeah, I think this is just saying the same thing, that there's no recognition in the schools about this need, in the university education faculties. It's a puzzlement to me. I really, if surely they must be reading the Pearls data. Surely they must be saying, our students, when they graduate, are going to go into those classrooms. Are we equipping them? It's very strange. Okay, now if that's the bad news, I don't know if this is worse or better. I said earlier, this is not a South African problem. It's an English-speaking world problem. It's present in the US, it's present in Australia, it is present in England. In fact, when the first Conservative government was voted in about 5 years ago, when they took over from Tony Blair, they appointed Michael Gove as Education Secretary. Now, in the unique English language, secretary means minister. He came up with this policy that teacher training was going to be taken away from the universities. He was going to put it in the schools. You go into a school and you learn how to teach on the job. It's quite a common view, actually. You hear the view, let's close the ed schools in America because they're doing such a bad job. I want to show you from, this is from an American study that was published last year that evaluated 612 initial teacher education programs in the US. More than half of them scored at 50 points or less on a 125-point scale. In other words, hulle het gedruip. And only 107 or 7% of those programs got 50% on this index of theirs. Similarly, in Australia, this is a quote from that American study. And again, it goes back to reading, guys. It's the same thing. We are disheartened that the teacher education field continues to disregard scientifically based methods of reading instruction. Now, in America, they had a national reading panel a couple of years ago that came up with what the best way is to teach reading. It's quite a controversial document. The universities are very conflicted about it, and clearly they're not taking it seriously, as this study so aptly said. And they're saying that because we're not adopting scientific reading methods for teaching reading, this explains why such a large proportion of American school children never learn to read beyond a basic level. So it's not unique to South Africa. In Australia, this year, the government published a survey, a very similar survey, which came to very similar conclusions. And what they're saying is we should regulate this field. We've got to come in with a big stick, we've got to set standards, and we've got to make sure our teachers meet those standards. And if the ed schools are not getting our students there, then we've got to do something about the ed schools. So America and Australia are getting quite het up about this. So we're not alone. Colleagues, as I said, this is an English-speaking problem. The Koreans don't have it. The Singaporeans do not have it in spades. The Finnish don't have it. Much of continental Europe is not in the same boat. It's the English-speaking world that has this peculiar problem. And I haven't really thought about why that should be. But nevertheless, the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, I've already mentioned that the Americans and Australians in English are really het up about this problem. This is a quote from Linda Darling-Hammond, a very prominent educational researcher in the US. And she says that the extent to which an occupation is micromanaged by rules from without, in other words, government regulation. If you've got strong government regulation, you should ask yourself why. Because we have failed to maintain high common standards of competence and professional practice. Now, you know, I often hear people in the education sector complaining that our society doesn't regard us highly. They treat us like dirt. They're always trying to boss us around. We've got all this bureaucracy that we've got to comply with. And the implication seems to be, go away, guys, leave us alone, accord us a high status, and we will do better. Well, actually, I want to say it works the other way around. We show ourselves to be professionals. We develop the best techniques for teaching reading. We start using those in our classes. And I'm not talking about present company. I'm sure our present company is generally quite good at teaching reading. I'm talking about the South African average. As soon as we start demonstrating competence, surely that's when society begins to give you a high status. So, you know, I think the boot is on our foot, actually. You know, all this complaint about government regulation and stuff, well, it's because we are not behaving like a profession. Now, this is the Higher Education Quality Council's recommendations. I mentioned them right at the beginning. They surveyed the initial teacher education terrain in 2010. They came out with this report, and they came up with a number of recommendations. Colleagues, I want to say that, in fact, if we follow the HEQC recommendations, we'll be in a lot better place than the Americans and Australians are. That American report that I mentioned is saying, what are we going to do about this? Well, what we must do is not employ teachers who come from ed schools that don't meet our standards. Districts must start investigating these things and only hire teachers that come from strong educational schools. The Australians, so the Americans are going for a market option. The Australians are going for a big stick, big brother, central regulation option. They're saying we must set up a strong regulator, we must assess these teachers coming out, and we must punish the schools that are not producing the right standards. Colleagues, I think both of those approaches are wrong. I think that a profession only develops from within. I can't see how government bureaucrats can formulate standards for teaching reading when they're not part of the process, when they actually know nothing about it, when they've never tried to do it themselves. The only people who can set standards for teaching reading are teacher educators and teachers. That's where it's got to start. And that's where a profession always starts, from within an occupational field, when the practitioners there decide, this is our body of knowledge, these are our standards, we're going to stick to them, and we're going to practice them in our jobs. And that's how you raise the status of an occupational field into full professionality. And in fact, this is what the HEQC review calls for. It says what is needed now in the teacher education community is a sustained period of reflection and debate in which the major issues that characterize teaching and learning are examined. You know, the study we did on the 5 campuses that I mentioned, I mean, we found even within a campus on a B.Ed program, there was very little communication between the lecturers on that program. They go off and do their own thing. They teach what they're interested in, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if they're not teaching reading, then, you know, one has to ask the question. So we need collaboration within the field. We need collaborative reflection. We need a systematic evaluation of the major teaching and learning innovations that have been carried out in the last 15 years. And good grief, there have been a lot of them. They are pouring out. In fact, I think we innovation drunk. And now we've got the 1+4 program that's being rolled out nationally. Do we ever reflect on these things? Do we ever evaluate and say, did it work? Generally, they don't work, actually. So we keep having new ones. Every year we've got a new innovation. But why did it not work? Are we not evaluating these things? And then we need a national program of intervention in both pre- and in-service training, teacher education, based on the outcomes of the work above. We've got to start behaving collaboratively, we've got to start behaving scientifically, and we've got to start working out what the best ways of teaching reading, primary maths, science, every subject you can name. But it seems like we're not doing that, and I think it's a huge problem. In fact, for me, that's the root problem of our school system. I want to end on a positive note to say that when we started publicizing this work of ours, teacher educators started saying, oh, is that what we're doing? Gee, that's not very good. And I think they're starting to wake up, actually. And arising spontaneously out of this work of ours, we've had 2 groups now coming out, a primary maths group and a primary literacy group that are beginning to collaborate in talking about, well, what should our student teachers be learning? How can we best teach reading to our kids at school? And how best can we teach our student teachers to do that? So ending on a positive note, I think we are moving in the right direction. It's a long process. And when I describe this to some people, they say, oh, gee, but that's going to take 30 years. Well, yeah, it's probably going to take 50 years. But you know, you look back on the last 22 years, they've flashed past in the blink of an eye. And where have we gone? We've expanded our education system massively, and that's not a bad thing. But guys, quality is not moving. And this is what we've got to do to get quality. Thank you.